Certain topics should be regulated. Today we're looking at vulnerability management and how DORA and NIS2 are influencing the requirements. You too will most likely be affected by these ideas. Hi, this is Carsten from Hacking Matters, where we look at the challenges in cybersecurity every week. Happy New Year and welcome to 2025, where I'm sure hacking challenges abound, some of which through regulation, having to comply with new regulation. Today we're diving into the implications of two sets of regulation related to one another, DORA for the financial industry in Europe and NIS2 for pretty much all other industries in Europe. Now these have global implications because they include supply chain security. So if you're doing business with anyone in Europe, you will have to comply with this regulation at some point. If you've followed the channel, you know I'm not a huge advocate of compliance and regulation. I think hacking defense is a management topic, it's a trade-off topic, it's something more tactical than a regulation can enforce. And yet certain topics, like for instance, privacy protections through GDPR should be regulated because otherwise the market forces don't lead to good outcomes. Today we're looking at vulnerability management and how DORA and NIS2 are influencing the requirements around vulnerability management. By my reading, these are sensible requirements. Some of you will already been implementing them. So it's really spreading best practices to your organizations, but also to your suppliers. The DORA regulation came into effect January 1st, 2025, and its biggest implications are around vulnerability management. To save you from the nitty-gritty of having to go through the whole regulation, I condensed for you the 9 implications that DORA requires from you around the areas of vulnerability assessment and vulnerability remediation. Starting with vulnerability assessment. Vulnerability assessment typically cover your own servers, cloud servers that you're using, but now the scope extends. So what are the 5 DORA implications in the area of vulnerability assessment? The first is you need to define your critical assets and scan them every single week. Language in the regulation as to what a critical asset is, but mostly you have to decide for yourself. Which systems, when they go down or the data gets stolen, pose an existential risk to your or your customers. And then you have to scan those systems every single week. Second, regularly scan all your assets, including on internal networks. Scans over the internet are very common, but you'll have to scan every single system on your premises, in your data centers, in your cloud environments. Do that regularly, preferably monthly. I think you can get away with quarterly as well. Third, you have to track third-party components, basically building software builds of materials for your applications. Be aware of what technology you depend on in terms of libraries and check in on their security status. There will be patches that your developers may not be aware of because they're just fine with the functionality of a library. But you as the security organization will now have to inform the developers that there are security relevant updates in some of the libraries they're using and that they have to patch them. Fourth, and this will be new for most of you, do security scans on external software that you're using, basically SaaS software provided by other companies. Either do those scans yourself or get assurance that those companies are already doing security scans. Basically, make sure they are DORA compliant so you can include that into your own compliance. And then fifth, make sure that all of this data we just talked about is stored in one central repository. Your internet scans, your internal scans, possible scans of external SaaS, make sure this is all available in one central database. So those are the requirements around vulnerability assessment. Some of you will already implement it exactly like this, but for most of you, this will now be a learning area. Best practice advice is pick your tool first that can hold all of this data and then walk backwards from there, extending the scans and integrating more tools. You do not want to rely on manual copy-paste between different data sources now that many of these scans are required on a weekly basis. Next, let's look at vulnerability remediation, where DORA has 4 implications. This is building on the previous requirement of having all the vulnerability assessment data in one central repository. So the first thing around vulnerability remediation is to rank every single vulnerability in your system by the same standards according to asset criticality and vulnerability criticality. Basically, build a ranking of how critical each vulnerability is to your organization. This can only be done automatically, of course, given that most organizations are looking at tens of thousands to tens of millions of vulnerabilities that are known about their systems. The second implication around vulnerability remediation is that you are guided by threat-led analysis. That means conceptualizing what criminal hackers or state-sponsored hackers are out there, which of them want to break into your system, and staying up to date about how they go about breaking into organizations like yours. This used to be called threat intelligence. Today it's called threat-led, penetration testing or red teaming, but the idea is always the same. Put yourself in the mind of the criminal hacker, and not just in a technical sense, but also what do they want and where do they hope to find it. This yet again gives you a filter on the vulnerabilities you already found. Some of these vulnerabilities are exactly what the criminals are usually looking for, hence you need to fix it at high priority, and others are not really related to your threat intelligence, so they can be a second priority. The third implication, define clear patching deadlines and define escalation procedures. Not everything can be patched in time. There's always some reason why this application can't reboot or that application is under change freeze. DORA requires you to have escalation procedures, basically making it more painful not to patch. And fourth and finally, track risk acceptances. So even DORA acknowledges that not everything will always be perfect and according to plan, but when you deviate from a plan, do write a risk acceptance and formally track them in a register. We did have another video on how to create a risk acceptance, so if you haven't started those processes yet, check that out. Overall, I believe these 9 requirements are sensible. They nudge you into having full visibility of vulnerabilities. You would feel somewhat overwhelmed because you have so many now, but then it nudges you to clear prioritization and to set clear targets, track those targets, and allow risk acceptances at the end. Full visibility, and yet rooted in practical best practices that we have seen organizations already implement in the past. Another regulation I should mention that's related is Tyber. Again, a regulation that applies to European financial institutions. Tyber requires organizations to do red teaming, which I believe is the most sensible way to baseline yourself versus criminal hackers' abilities and to know how far from your goals you are. Between DORA and Tyber, there's a lot of good practices to build effective threat and vulnerability management. And I guess if you're a financial institution in Europe, you don't have another choice anymore anyway. So hopefully this really moves us ahead as an industry and then can trickle down to some other industry. The NIS2 regulation takes many of the same ideas and then applies them to a much broader set of industries. So with time, you too will most likely be affected by these ideas. Hopefully you found some of them useful. If you did, show it with a like and subscribe. Ask your questions below. Any feedback is welcome. I'll see you next week. Until then, thank you and happy hacking.